Howdy. Here we are again. If it seems like I'm a little closer today, that's because I mounted the phone in a different place. It's easier to mount it here than where I had it before. Where I had it before was a balancing act. So if it makes you uncomfortable, just back away from your screen a little bit. Maybe I can move my seat back a little bit to make it more, oops, that's not the right way. Here we go. There we go. We just back that up. Okay, is that better? All right, since we're starting a new series today, we're still building on what went before. So all the stuff I said about epistemology and naturalism and idealism, it's still relevant to what we're going to talk about from here forward, but this is kind of a new part of it. So we're going to talk about natural theology for the next few videos, and that has to do with arguments for the existence of God. On today's video, okay, since we're going into a new series, I thought I ought to remind the viewers, just in case there's any people who are beginning here and skipping all that necessary stuff that came before, why we're doing this series. It has to do with the fact that it's really difficult for me to speak. I'm a horrible speaker. And it isn't just that I have a difficult time speaking in front of other people, you know, like giving a speech or something like that. Actually, I don't have any experience giving speeches, unless you count presenting papers in college, stuff like that. But that was a long time ago. But even in like normal conversation, when I'm just talking to somebody face to face, I always have a little bit of panic inside of me because I always feel like I've got to get my words out before I get interrupted, or I feel like just time is moving faster and I can't think of how I want to say something. When I'm writing, it's easy because I can mull things over. I can write a sentence. I can go back and edit it. If it's a complicated thing, I can like think through how I want to present it in a way that makes sense. But when I'm talking, it's like you only get one chance and you have to say stuff. And if you're in a conversation with somebody, you know, it feels like there can't be any awkward silences. And so you got to just keep talking and talking, and it just stresses me out. And so that's one reason I think that I have a difficult time speaking. So like I'll be in the middle of a conversation with somebody and I can't think of a word, and I'll just like, what's that word? And so I feel like I'm in such a hurry that I can't take the time to think of the right word. And so I'll just use a substitute word, but it's the wrong word. It doesn't really capture what I'm trying to say. And I just have a really difficult time getting through sentences and paragraphs and stuff like that. It's very hard for me to speak. And so I thought if I did a series of videos or a podcast or something like that, that I could get some practice. I'm really not a very social person because I have really bad social anxiety, and this pandemic has made it even worse. So I don't really socialize with people at all, hardly. And so it seems like the older I get and as time goes by, the more difficult it has become for me to speak. And so I thought if I did this series of posts, that I could improve my ability just to speak fluidly or whatever. You know, since I've been watching these videos, I've noticed how many times I say or whatever. I'm starting to notice that I've got these speech patterns that I have that I didn't notice before, and they're really getting on my nerves. So I'm going to try to break some of those habits. I'm going to try to stop saying or whatever after everything I say or whatever. Okay, so that's why this exists. The reason I chose apologetics is because that happens to be one of the few things that I actually can talk about a lot. So it gives me material. So the main goal of this whole series is not to teach you apologetics or to persuade you that Christianity is true. If I happen to do that along the way, that'd be great, but that's not the primary purpose, just so as you know. So I'm not going to necessarily go into the same detail in a lot of the things I'm talking about as I would if I were trying to teach apologetics or trying to persuade people that Christianity is true. I'm mostly just wanting to have subject matter. And so, without further ado, let me begin today's topic. Since we're starting a series on arguments for God, I wanted to do this kind of introductory post about and make some general comments about natural theology. Criticism of natural theology comes both from atheists and even from other Christians, and some of the criticisms are the same in both cases. And one of the main criticisms is that even if these arguments are sound, they still don't bring you to Christian theism. A lot of Christians will complain, well, they just give you deism at the most. And one of the criticisms that atheists give is that even if they're sound, they don't tell you everything about the Christian God. So like they don't tell you that, like, for example, the Kalam cosmological argument, if that one gives you any indication that there's a God or anything like a God, all it tells you is that this being is powerful enough to create the universe. But that doesn't tell you that the being is all powerful. And the teleological argument or atheological argument might tell you that the being is intelligent, but it doesn't tell you how intelligent it is. It doesn't tell you that it's all-knowing. And so those are some of the criticisms. I don't think these are very good criticisms. There are, okay, first let me say something about these different families of arguments. Some people are under the impression that there's such a thing as the cosmological argument or the teleological argument or the moral argument or whatever. I did it again, didn't I? But really, these are families of arguments. There's a whole family of arguments that are cosmological arguments, and they all are different arguments. They argue for God in different ways. But what makes them cosmological is that they all have something to do with some feature of the universe, usually either the existence of the universe or the beginning of the universe or the contingency of the universe or motion in the universe or something about the universe that requires something resembling a God to explain it. Teleological arguments are all about design in the universe. Well, that can be different things. There can be design in biological organisms or design in the fine-tuning of the constants or whatever. So there are different kinds of teleological arguments. And there are different versions of ontological arguments. So, anywho, there are, what's his name? Ed Feser has a book called 5 Arguments for God. And whereas like most of the arguments that a lot of you might be familiar with, like the Kalam cosmological argument, the arguments that you hear from William Lane Craig and people like that, these arguments don't tell you that God is all-knowing or all-powerful or, any of the omni attributes that Christians typically attribute to Yahweh. But Ed Feser's arguments do give you those things. Now, I've read Ed Feser's book, 5 Arguments for God, and I don't understand it. I'll have to read it a few more times. But the conclusion of his argument is that God is all-knowing and all-powerful and perfectly good. He basically has all the attributes of God. But even those arguments are missing some things about the Christian God, namely the Trinity. None of his arguments show that God is a Trinity. None of his arguments show that God answers prayers. And so there are lots of things that they don't show about God. Now, I don't think that these arguments are useless just because they don't tell you everything there is to know about the Christian God, or even that the God that exists is the Christian God. So let me use an analogy. Let's suppose that that you're an investigator and you're trying to find out, who committed a crime or whatever. So you look at the crime scene and there's all kinds of little pieces of evidence. Like say it's a violent crime and you notice that somebody got punched in the face multiple times on just one side of their face. Well, you can surmise from that the person who committed the crime was probably right-handed. That's why all the bumps and bruises are on the left side of the face, because the person was punching with the right hand. So you look at all these all these things, and you apply the indiscernibility of identicals, and you say, well, the criminal was right-handed, was maybe a man, wore a certain size shoe because you had footprints or whatever, so you match all these things up with potential people or whatever, and so you narrow it down to a certain group of suspects, and the more you narrow it down, the more you can figure out which one of those suspects is the criminal. Now, in this process, you don't have to be able to discover everything that's true, because I mean, imagine you go to trial and you've got all this evidence against Bob, that Bob is the criminal, and imagine the defense attorney stands up and says, sure, all these things that are true about the criminal are also true about Bob. However, if you haven't noticed yet, Bob is missing his 2 front teeth. There is no evidence in your criminal case that the criminal is missing 2 front teeth. Therefore, you haven't proven that it's Bob. Well, that's obvious nonsense. And so when you read books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and at the beginning of chapter 4, I think, he addresses what he thinks is the cosmological argument. Is actually a cosmological argument. He doesn't criticize the cosmological argument. Instead, all he does is complain about what the cosmological argument does not show. It does not show, for example, that God answers prayers. Well, so what? You don't need to show that God answers prayers in order to identify which God is talking about. Now, I think I think these arguments have more value than a lot of people give them credit for, because even though these arguments may not show that God has all these attributes that Christians think that God has, they do seem to point in that general direction. So take these arguments together. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the Kalam cosmological argument, the argument from contingency, and the moral argument are all true, or all sound arguments. So that gives you a being that created, is the absolute originator of the entire physical cosmos, and exists by necessity, has necessary existence, and is absolutely autonomous and authoritative and sovereign, which is what you get from the moral argument. So most of the gods of most religions are not like that. Most of them kind of exist within the cosmos. Most of them, if you look at the Greek and Roman gods, aren't even responsible for any kind of creation. Now, there are a lot of creation accounts that exist in different religions. But even those creation accounts usually consist of a being who is working with pre-existing material. It doesn't bring the entire cosmos into existence out of nothing. And so, and usually these gods are not like the supreme authority. They're not like they don't create right and wrong, or they're not like the ground or basis for all authority and stuff like that. They're not these autonomous and sovereign beings. They're very powerful beings, but so think about this. The God of Judaism, or the idea of Yahweh, existed long before any of these philosophical arguments ever came up, which means that the Jewish people did not come up with this God as a result of those arguments. And so if these arguments are sound, then you would have a God that resembles the God that the Jews came up with. Now, that would be an enormous coincidence if a God exists that some culture just kind of invented a God that's a lot like, that's that much like the God that actually exists. So either that's a huge coincidence, or else this God actually revealed himself to the Jewish people at some point. So although I can agree that these arguments don't get you all the way to the Christian God, it seems to me that at the very least, they do kind of narrow the scope of what God we're talking about, and they do give us enough reason to want to look into Judaism or Christianity or Islam or any of the religions that that have a God that's like that, because it does give us some reason to suspect that maybe this God did reveal himself to somebody in the past. And that's how they came up with the God, because they obviously didn't come up with the God through these philosophical arguments. There was more I wanted to say about these arguments. May have to edit this part out. Okay, so in light of the fact that these arguments that I'm going to talk about don't get you all the way to the Christian God, let me explain how I mean for these arguments to work in my whole case for Christianity. What they do is they get you closer to Christianity, like they narrow the scope. As I explained in a previous video, I started off talking about broad worldviews, idealism versus naturalism versus dualism. And then I'm narrowing the scope. I tried to show that dualism is true. So now we know that both the physical world and the non-physical world exist, and that, disembodied minds exist, or minds exist and are not physical things. So now, we've got supernaturalism. Now what I want to show is that there's some sort of God, or there's a creator of the universe. There's an absolute moral authority of the universe, and it's a necessary being. So now we've narrowed the scope even more. Now something that looks more like the Christian God exists. So the way I'm going to get to the Christian God specifically is through the resurrection of Jesus. There are two ways to identify a God. You can identify a God through these arguments, but you can also give an ostensive definition. And that would be like saying, well, God is the one who did this thing, raised Jesus from the dead, or gave the law to Moses, or whatever. So that's an ostensive way to point to something. So yeah, what these arguments do, I think, is if it's true that there's this creator of the universe who imposes moral obligations on people, then that increases the probability that something like the Christian God exists. And so if something like this powerful being that's able to create the entire universe out of nothing exists, then that makes miracles possible. And so the resurrection of Jesus, it seems to me, would be more possible or more likely if such a being existed than if no such being existed. If there was no God of any sort, then the resurrection of Jesus would be well nigh impossible. But since there is such a God, then the resurrection of Jesus is more possible. So what this is supposed to do is make it easier on your noetic structure to accept the conclusion that Jesus was raised from the dead. And if you accept that, then that can become an argument for the Christian God. So anyway, that's how these arguments are supposed to work. Oh, there was one more thing I wanted to say that I couldn't think of earlier. J. Warner Wallace has this book where he tries to argue for the existence of God by using analogies from, criminal investigations. So in each chapter, he'll give like a different argument for God, and he'll have a little box that'll say the suspect, and then he'll give like attributes from the suspect. So from the claim cosmological argument, you get that he's powerful because he created the universe. He's timeless and immaterial because he created everything. He created all of space-time. And then in the next chapter, you'll see the suspect again. And then he'll give these things. And as I was reading this, I was thinking, well, there's a big mistake that's being made here. He's assuming that the suspect in the cosmological argument is the same person as the suspect in the moral argument or the teleological argument or whatever argument there are. And he didn't argue that. And that seemed to be problematic to me, because just by calling somebody the suspect raises the question, suspect for what? If you were doing a criminal investigation and you saw a broken glass, or, somebody's house had been broken into, and you said, okay, these are the things we know about the suspect. And then you went out and you discovered a murder had happened in a park. and you started saying, okay, we can add these things to the suspect, well, obviously that's a mistake, because the suspect in the house that had been broken into may not be the same person as the suspect in the murder. So to say that somebody's the suspect, you have to say the suspect for what? The suspect in the breaking in of the house, or the suspect in the murder? So he was just kind of assuming that they were the same person in each case. So what I intend to do is argue that is to fill in that gap, and to explain why I think the suspect in these different arguments are all pointing to the same person. And I can just go ahead and do that right now. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that these arguments are sound. The cosmological argument, the argument from contingency, and the moral argument. So it seems to me that these arguments kind of complement each other in a way that would be a big coincidence if they didn't complement each other. I'm not explaining that right. I'm going to put a link to 2 articles on my blog that I've written about that will explain this a lot more clearly. I'm doing this all off the top of my head because, as I said before, the object is to become a better speaker. And I can't become a better speaker if I'm using a teleprompter, right? So I'm doing this without notes. So okay, like take the moral argument. The moral argument gives you a being that has absolute moral authority over all of creation. And so that raises the question, well, how could anybody have that kind of authority? Obviously, I can't have that authority. If I made a list of rules, nobody would be obligated to obey me. And if I were like a king or something, then sure, I would have authority over my domain. But, the King of France wouldn't have any obligation to obey. So basically, it's hard to think of any kind of created being that could have the kind of authority that would be necessary to ground morality, because morality is the law above all other laws. It's the law by which we judge civil law. So what kind of being could possibly have that? Well, if you look over at the cosmological arguments, you see that here's a being that created everything, and everything else owes its existence to this being. And so it seems like that sort of being would explain how something could have absolute authority. If this being has no peers, it doesn't owe its existence to anything else, but everything else owes its existence to this being. Well, that being would be like the end-all be-all, it would be, everything would revolve around that being, and it seems like that sort of being could explain moral authority. So it seems like these arguments can kind of complement each other in a way. And there are ways that the argument from contingency and the argument and the cosmological argument also kind of reinforce each other. And I wrote about that on my blog, and I can't think of that off the top of my head, so I'll just leave you a link. So I think there is reason to think that actually J. Warner Wallace did kind of address that in a later chapter. In the later chapter, what he did was he took all the properties that he had of the suspect, and he compared them to the God of the Bible. And he showed how the God of the Bible created everything, the God of the philosophers created everything, therefore they're the same God. So he kind of matched these things up, matched all these properties of the suspect with the God of the Bible, to make like an inductive case that these arguments are supporting the God of the Bible. It's sort of the same thing. So anyhow, I guess that's all I had to say about that. I'm going to go to the grocery store now.